Hey everyone, it's Laura Creative Twilight. Today I wanted to talk about painting black on miniatures. It's one of those colors that seems easy, but it's actually a little more difficult than people think it is. It seems simple because there's no need to shade it, just throw a highlight on there and call it good. However, there's a little more to it, and that's what I wanted to walk you through today. This particular ogre here, I base coated the pants with Incubi Darkness. It's not actually a black, it's kind of a green blue. I really don't know what to call it, but it's a really cool color. What I did with it is I washed it with Nuln Oil or black wash just to really tone it down. It's admittedly not black, but it's a nice alternative and it looks pretty close to black. Now, this next one is actually base coated with black. And that's what most people think of. And what I did on this one was I used grays for the midtones and the highlights to give a more traditional look to black. This is what most people think of, and I still do it as well. So I wanted to throw this in here as well as showing you a few different ways to go about this. So here's another alternative to a black base coat. This one's base coated with Eshin Gray, which is a very dark gray. So I base coated that. I used a black wash to get some shading on there, and then I did a little mid-tone work with a slightly lighter gray. Again, it's not black, but it just shows you another way to go about it. I could have added more washes to this to get this to really a black color with very dark gray highlights, so that's an option as well. Now I want to move on to talking about midtones. This is where things can get a little different and where black can become tricky. You could do black and you can just do grays, and that's great. Again, I still do it, but it can look a little monotone. So in this example here, this is the queen from Thorns of the Briar Queen. What I did was I base coated in black, and then my mid-tone, sort of that middle highlight that you see on the cape there, was done with that Incubi Darkness I'd previously mentioned. So it gives it kind of a bluish green tone to it, and kind of changes the look and the appearance of it. So it's still black, but it's a little more interesting. One of my favorite things to do with black is to use blues for midtones and highlights. So if you look at that left flesh golem, the pants, base coated black, and then I used a very dark slate blue for the midtone. I also used it for the highlights as well. And it just gives it a more interesting look, and I kind of wanted to tie that back into the flesh. If you look at the flesh golem on the right, his leather jacket, same thing, I used the blue tones just to give it a little more visual interest. So here I have Garrick from Garrick's Reavers, and this was a more traditional black to gray approach. You notice the screen left leg that's propped up. I did a very dark gray on the top, and then a slightly lighter gray on top of that to kind of give a little focal point for the subtle reflection that would appear on the pants. So this is a more traditional approach which really worked with this miniature. So you can definitely use gray tones and they work. Just want to give some other alternatives. And the other thing as well, which I'll talk about more a little later, is the type of material is going to affect how bright you go with these midtones and highlights. And the last example working with midtones here is the shoulder on this Chaos Knight. It's pretty dark. I did a lot of really subtle blending here. I didn't want to go too bright on this. This was early in my blending work and I was afraid to get things too light. But you'll notice up towards the top of the shoulder, you'll see that sort of dark slate blue color. It's kind of hard to pick up, but it's there and it's subtle, which is what I was going for at the time. So using that blue, like I said, it's one of my favorite approaches, just makes it look more interesting. Moving on to highlighting now, kind of the final stage, and for the most part, kind of what sells everything. So I'll start off first with these Thorns of the Briar Queen Warband. Again, I previously mentioned the Incubi Darkness midtone. From there, I went to using bluish gray whites. I didn't want to go to the gray family, I wanted to stick to that blue color, so I layered them up using that blue color to pull back to the Incubi Darkness and just to make it all a little different. This Chaos Rhino is a pretty extreme example of highlighting. I painted this rhino probably 8 years ago. At that point, I really wasn't working with midtones. I definitely wasn't blending. Everything just got edge highlighted. In this particular case, I use a very, very bright blue white, and that's what you see here. It almost looks white, but if you look close enough, you can pick up on the blue tones to it. and it just looked more interesting. I didn't want to go with grays, and the color I used to highlight this black is the same colors I was using on that more blue side. So all the colors you see on that opposing side, those are all the colors I was using for highlights on this side. So I just pulled it all back together. These whites from my Blood Bowl team, these were a little different. I was starting to play around with non-metallic metals more, so I was kind of going for something like that with the blacks on here. They're supposed to be kind of a silver color, it's kind of somewhere in between, but it was a black base coat. I used grays for midtones, but when it came to the highlight, I used that very white, light blue, the same color I showed in the Rhino example. So shifting tones, I was going from black to gray to blue, and it gives that interesting look you see here. So that's something you can do is just play around, use different, your base coat, your midtone, and your highlight. They don't all have to be the same. So something a little different for the end of the highlighting here. This Chaos Lord on his Juggernaut of Khorne, that bowl is base coated black, and then everything's highlighted, edge highlighted in red. Now this isn't black, it's clearly reads as red because of the highlights, but I just wanted to show you an example of sort of interesting things you can do. You don't have to highlight black with grays or even the blues that I've been talking about or things like that. You can do something extreme and just fun like this. If you took something and edge highlighted black with, say, a green, it would kind of give it a techno-y, kind of glowing look. So there's all sorts of different things you can try and experiment with. The final thing I want to talk about are the types of materials. A common mistake a lot of beginner painters make is that they highlight everything the same. So if you're highlighting cloth, that's a different approach to if you're highlighting armor. Cloth, for example, does not reflect light like metal does. It's a softer material, it absorbs light, it dulls it down, it's just far less reflective. So when you're highlighting cloth, you're going to stick with darker colors for your midtones and your highlights. You're not going to go very extreme. Extreme being like the example I did on the Rhino, but that's an example of metal, so that makes sense. I wouldn't go that bright on cloth. I'm going to keep it dull, I'm going to keep it muted. Here we have Batman, and Batman's suit is made of leather, so this falls between something like cloth and metal. Most leather's got a reflective element to it if it's not old worn leather. So as you can see in this example, it's got some nice reflective elements to it. You'll also notice it's reflecting in blue tones, which again is my favorite approach, and I think it's because of this. I just really like the look of this. So when you're doing leather, you're going to go somewhere in between. You're going to get some reflective elements. You're not going to bounce it as much as you would with metal, but you're not going to be as muted as if you're working with cloth either. Lastly, we have a car. So we have a highly reflective surface. Because cars have a clear coat to them, they bounce a lot of light. So this is your extreme example. This is something like you're going to do if you're working like non-metallic metals and stuff, is to create this very high contrast. So when you're painting a black metal, that's what you want. You want a lot of light. You'll also notice too how the light works. So if you look at the side, you'll see that the light comes down, it gets bright, gets near white, drops off to black. That's just the reflection. That's, it's picking up the road. Up above it's picking up the sky, and then it just drops off. So there's not a big subtle transition. You'll notice it kind of fades down to the white. So you have some blending there, you have a gradation, and then it drops off. So that's how you sell a very reflective black surface, is creating that strong contrast. So that's all I plan to talk about today. Hopefully I've given you a few things to think about. There's a lot of stuff I don't know, and there's a lot of different approaches I'm probably not aware of. This is just what I've learned through years of experience and what I personally like. So just play around with things. Don't just do black and grays. Experiment. Next time you're going to paint, just try something different with the black. Worst case, you just paint over it and do it again. So I hope you've enjoyed what I've done here. If you haven't, please subscribe, give a thumbs up, and I'll catch you all later.